In this lecture, we're going to start using variables for storing data. So far, we've written comments. They're nice and all, but they're not all PHP has to offer. Programmers are often dealing with data. Data can range from addresses to the price of a product. Often, most pages on the web rely on data. Otherwise, we'd be staring at the same page. PHP has a feature called variables for storing data. A common analogy for variables is boxes. We can use boxes for storing physical items. If you're moving, it's common to label boxes to describe the contents of the box. For instance, if a box contains dishes and utensils, you may label the box as kitchen. The inner contents of the box can be considered the value. Variables are similar to boxes from the real world. Unlike boxes, variables don't store physical items. Instead, they can store file data, form data, or data from a database. They're extremely flexible for storing any kind of data. Let's try creating a variable. In the index file, I'm going to clear the contents of the file except for the opening PHP tag. Everything else isn't necessary. After doing so, type the following: $age, semicolon. There are a few rules for writing variables in PHP. Variables must begin with a $sign character. By typing this character, PHP allocates memory on a user's machine to store data. This symbol is followed by the name of the variable. Variable names follow strict rules. Firstly, names are allowed to contain alphabetic characters, numbers, and underscores. Secondly, special characters are not allowed. For example, the @ symbol can't be used as a variable name. Lastly, the first character of a variable name may be a letter or underscore. While numbers are allowed in variable names, they cannot be the first character. Besides these rules, PHP gives us a lot of freedom in naming our variables. There are a few good practices worth mentioning. Firstly, variable names should be descriptive. For example, let's say we had a variable for storing the total price of a user's purchase. The name of the variable could be called total price. That name is short, clear, and concise. A bad example would be an abbreviation called TP. We might understand what that means, but what would our coworkers think of the name? If you're working on a team, your team members may not be able to understand the purpose of the variable. Descriptive names provide clarity. In some cases, you may need to use abbreviations for variables with long names. If that's the case, your abbreviations should be easily recognizable. For example, we may need to store the name of a customer. A good abbreviation would be CUST name, where CUST is short for customer. However, using the name CUSTN is harder to recognize. Another useful tip is to avoid using single letters as variable names. This circles back to the first tip. Using a single letter doesn't describe the type of data stored in a variable. With that being said, some developers will use a single letter when dealing with loops. That's the only scenario where using single letters is fine. In most cases, you should stick to using longer, descriptive names. Being consistent is another good habit to pick up. Your variable names should have consistent spelling. Mixing the casing of your variables can result in confusing and unreadable code. Last but not least, you should avoid generic names. For example, you may need to store user data in a variable. It may be tempting to call the variable data, but that doesn't exactly describe what type of data you're storing. Are you storing file data, database data, or maybe you're storing product data? The more precise you are, the better. Overall, these tips should help you with naming your variables. What if you need to write multiple words from within a variable name? As mentioned before, we can't use special characters, such as spaces. Developers have come up with 3 naming conventions for these scenarios. The first naming convention is called camel casing. In this format, every word is capitalized except for the first word. By doing so, it's easier to read the words in a variable name. Up next, we have a format called Pascal casing, which is similar to camel casing. Every word is capitalized, including the first word. Lastly, snake casing is another format that uses lowercase letters. Instead of capitalizing each word, words are separated with underscores. You're allowed to use whatever naming convention suits your application. Generally speaking, most PHP developers prefer camel casing for variables. However, If you decide to use a different naming convention, that's perfectly fine. The most important thing is to be consistent. For this course, I'll be sticking with camel casing for multi-worded variable names. We've successfully created our first variable. Currently, it doesn't store anything. In the next set of lectures, let's start storing data.